All right, so everything that I'm going to show you now is more or less also already available on GitHub. So we're going to start with this data collection application function repository. And what this gives us is a service provider library and an application function. And the service provider library, you can use that together with the application function that is provided as part of this repository. And we have an open to-do to also integrate that with our 5G media streaming application function. And the idea behind all of this, and I'm going to show you very quickly the architecture, is to have a data collection application function that is able or responsible for receiving data reports from user entities and then processing these data reports and exposing them to subscribed event consumers. If you take a look at the architecture here, and BBC implemented it, as I said, and also gave us a very detailed overview previously. So we're not going to dive into the architecture for now, but just for basic understanding, we have our data collection application function here in the middle. And then we have this R1 interface to do the provisioning from an application service provider point of view. On the UE side, we have something like a direct data collection client that is doing the reports. And then again, on the application service provider side, we can consume such reports in a way that we get the information exposed by the data collection AF. And for that reason, we need to subscribe for certain events, and then we get a notification in the end. So all of this is already available here as part of this repository. What was a bit hidden before is how to make the actual calls to this data collection application function via the R1 interface, how to subscribe, and also how to trigger these reports. And functional wise, this was implemented as part of the tests that the repository contains. And what we would like to show you now is, first of all, how to set everything up with Docker, and then use Insomnia. And Insomnia is a REST-based client that has a user interface in order to do the configuration and receive these reports. So it's a bit more straightforward compared to what we had before, because what we had before is really focusing on testing these interfaces. And as I said, it's not a functional extension, but rather makes it a bit easier for you to replicate the setup and try experimenting or playing around with it. So as I said, this is available on GitHub. It's already merged in the development branch. And as part of this Docker-based setup, we also provided a tutorial. So everything that I'm going to show you is part of our Getting Started guide, and you can find this in the UE data collection section under tutorials. So if you want to replicate what I'm going to show you right now, everything documented here. Okay, good. So as a starting point, what I'm going to do now is I'm going to open my editor here and just going to quickly show you what we added as part of this pull request. So I can't unfortunately zoom here on the left side, so I hope you can read that. But the data collection application function repository now has a Docker folder where all the Docker files are available. And the setup is kind of comparable to what we did before. So usually we have this Docker compose file. The Docker compose file defines different services. And each of the services either started one by one or they start at the same time. So in this case, we need a network repository function that the data collection AF can register with. This is just something we grab from the hosted container, let's call it like that, or there's like a repositories where hosted containers are available. And this is coming from Open5GS. And there are some configuration variables being set here, but no specific changes here at this point, at least from the Docker side. And then we have a data collection application function that is also started via Docker. There's a dedicated Docker file as part of this Docker folder where all the different steps are performed in order to do the setup, installation, and starting the data collection AF. What we do also here in the Docker compose file is we export certain ports from the Docker container to the host machine. And that way we can later on access these different interfaces of the data collection AF. And then finally, we also start an HTTP 2 server that is responsible for receiving the data reports as an event subscriber. And the Docker files are new, but this HTTP 2 server is basically also just taken from this test folder that you see down here. So that's a sample Python server that David implemented that is part of all these test scripts. So in order to test the different interfaces at different endpoints, this HTTP2 server was used in order to receive the final reports. I just copied this file over and made one like minor change in order to expose this to the host machine. I just set the or changed the IP here, but everything else is the same. Still, I wanted to have like a bit of a difference or like a bit of a separation between what we do in the test folder and what we do with the Docker installation. All right. So in order to start all of this, and I think I can zoom here, yes. You first of all need to install Docker, and then you do the Docker build step. I already did this before, otherwise it would take too long. And the first step I'm going to do now is I'm just going to start the Docker containers. So I type Docker compose up, and all the containers started now. So everything that is defined here in this Docker compose file is now being started, which means we have an NRF running, a data collection application function running, and our web server running. All right. And if we take a look at the architecture again, we have these different interfaces. And what you will find in the documentation, but also directly in the GitHub repository, is this sequence diagram of the calls that we want to execute. This should be this one, yes. So that's a simple setup in order to configure the data collection application function, trigger a report, and then receive this report on the web server. So we're gonna do what we're gonna do now is go step by step through these different steps that are depicted here. And for that reason, we're gonna use Insomnia. And as I mentioned in the beginning, Insomnia is just a small program that lets you define REST calls, save them in a collection, and execute them or send them to a web server. This is very similar to what we have with Postman for 5G media streaming. And originally, I wanted to use Postman, but there's one setting, and I'm going to show you this, that we need to do in order to actually talk to the data collection application function. And this is the preferred HTTP version that you see here. And we need to set this to HTTP to prior knowledge. David pointed that out, I think, one of the previous calls. Otherwise, the calls are not being processed. And this is an option that I could not set in Postman directly. So I moved over to this Insomnia-based setup. But in general, they work quite similar. So you can define, as I said, REST calls, you can find a collection and then export that. And everything that you see here on the left side, all of these calls, we exported that as an Insomnia collection, and that's also available as part of the GitHub repository. So you can just import that and you have all the calls available. One thing that I wanted to mention in addition is that next to defining these REST calls, you can, and this is where I always struggle, I think I need to click here, you can define environment variables. And this is quite handy because you can define such a variable and later on set the value of this variable and use it in your different routes. So if you take this provisioning session ID as an example, I can simply use this variable in my host route over here, and the value that is currently set for this variable will be placed in the route. And that way I can avoid copy pasting all these IDs back and forth by simply assigning a variable to the ID and then using this value inside the route itself. And this approach, together with what you see here as a script, and it's like this, as a script here, is quite helpful when it comes to doing these REST calls, because you can execute certain scripts after a REST call has been executed or before the call has been executed. And for most of these calls that you see here on the left side, we have an after response script, which means we do a request and then this script is triggered afterwards, and we can extract some of the values that we get either in the payload of the response or in the headers of the response, and then assign them to a variable. And that way we avoid more or less copy pasting all these different IDs that we get back from the application function. We simply do this automated processing and we have the right value in this environment variable. So that's quite straightforward then. So in this case, as an example, we do create a new data reporting provisioning session, and then we assign the value that we get in this JSON response later on to the environment variable. And then for the next call, we can use the updated value directly without doing any copy paste. Okay, so this is Insomnia. And now I'm going to do this or follow these steps that I showed you previously. I just have to open this one again. So in order to do like a, let's call it end-to-end setup, we first need to register our data collection application function with a network repository function. And this is done automatically once we do the docker compose up command, or we run this command. What you will also find in the Docker folder here on the left side are log files. And if I open the data collection AF log file now, you can see this line here, NF registered, which means it automatically already registered with the network repository function that we started. So there's no manual step required at this point from our side. So that's the first step. And then what we're going to do now is we create a data reporting provisioning session. And that's something we need to do as an application provider. So we go over to the Insomnia client. We use this R1 interface. Sorry for jumping back and forth. So that's the interface here from the provisioning application function or application service provider to the data collection AF. The call is defined here. We define a certain body and we do a simple post request. And actually my send button is blocked by Zoom. Okay, so we did this right now, and what we get back is a provisioning session ID that is automatically saved in an environment variable using this after response script. So that's the first step. We can also try to retrieve this afterwards, so we can see, okay, something has been created. The next step in the diagram is to actually create a data reporting configuration, again, as an application provider. So we go to Insomnia, we create a new data reporting configuration. There are certain attributes that you need to define. I'm not going through them right now, but you can change this all as part of the body that we are sending out. Again, you can see that we have automatically filled these variables here. So we do a send. We get, again, some payload back. We're going to process that in the response script afterwards. And going back to the diagram. So, and now we have everything set up from a provisioning side. Next, we're going to register for events. And in order to do that, we need to do one manual step because we actually want to register for events. And these events should be sent to our web server that we later on use to simply dump the data to disk. And what you can see here is a notification URI. So we're going to receive the reports at this URL. And the server that we started as part of this Docker setup dynamically creates or chooses a port. So this port changes after each start. So we need to do one manual step here. We go to our log file, and actually it should be this one. And there we can see the IP and the port. And we now need to just copy the port, paste this here, and then we get the notifications to the right port under which the HTTP server is executed. And that's all. So everything else is pre-configured. So we're going to do the send here as well. We get some notification back again. And then going back to our diagram, we registered for the event. And now we can actually create a data report. And that's something that is done on the UE side. So if you take a look at the architecture again, we have this data collection client that is using the R2 interface in this case. So in Insomnia, we're going to start creating a new data reporting session via R2 interface. We sent that. We have done that. So we have our data reporting session created. And now, oops, it was wrong. We're going to actually report some data. And David and Richard can comment on that. But from my understanding, what's supported at this point is a so-called consumption report. No, sorry, communication report. So there's one pre-configured communication report here. This is the payload. We're going to send that to the data collection application function. And that's it, more or less. And now if we did everything right, and I hope we did, we should receive a notification on our HTTP web server that is then printed in the logs. So if we go back to the Docker container and we check the logs of the HTTP server that are dumped here, we can see that we actually received a notification, and this is the body of the notification. And this matches what we just created as a report. So you see this uplink and downlink volume that we sent. If I go back to the communication report, this matches the values that we sent. So we did send this, application function was processing it, and then exposing that to the subscribed HTTP2 server. And that's it, more or less. So we more or less followed all the different steps here. What we could do now is we could destroy the different sessions. I'm not doing this right now, but the corresponding REST calls are also included here. So we can run a delete for all of these different sessions that we just created. Okay, so before I hand over for any questions that you might have, so all of this, as I said, is already included as part of the test folder. So this was part of the test suite that was executed when doing the development. Now these codes that I just show you that are included in Insomnia are just taking from these shell scripts that the BBC created. So this is nothing new, but as I said in the beginning, it makes it a bit easier for you to do configurations and testing because you have this Insomnia client and you have the Docker-based setup where you basically just run Docker compose, build and up, and then everything is started for you automatically.